I'm pretty sure the game doesn't do this anymore. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But does anyone else remember that screen Deltarune used to give you that told you that the game was intended for players who were familiar with Undertale? And how it would give you the option to either choose to check out Undertale beforehand or just to play Deltarune instead? Because I certainly do. I remember when I was met with that screen for the first time and all I could think was, oh, I am beyond familiar, trust me. Hey, hi, hello, it's closing time, and today I'd like to talk about Deltarune, Undertale's parallel story and successor. I'm sure most fans are aware of the tale of how Toby Fox created Undertale to prove to himself that he could make his dream game a reality, that dream game in question being Deltarune. As a result, Undertale in many ways acts as context to Deltarune, to the point it's a bit hard to talk about one without at least mentioning the other sometimes. But despite this fact, however, both games remain distinct from each other with their own identities and unique executions of similar and differing concepts. The most striking similarities between Undertale and Deltarune truly come from their shared narrative themes, as well as how both of the game's stories can only be told as compellingly as they are through the format of video games, something that makes Toby Fox's games especially memorable experiences. I'll get to Kris specifically in a minute, as they're the focus of the video, make no mistake. But first, I'd like to talk about Undertale for some of that context for Deltarune mentioned earlier, which will help when talking about Kris later. Undertale, as a concept, is an RPG that is intended to subvert expectations. Instead of fighting, you can talk to the monsters you encounter and spare them, a subversion of what you'd expect from most RPGs. When you fight, you are frowned upon and punished with consequences. Again, a subversion from most RPGs. So Deltarune as the successor not only subverts expectations generally, but also subverts the expectations of existing fans of Undertale and uses similarities for moments of various emotions from said fans. One of these primary concepts of subversions that both Undertale and Deltarune use is the relationship between the player and the so-called self-insert characters within the games. Undertale has this strange triangle relationship between the player, the first fallen human, Kara, and the seventh fallen human, Frisk. Like, is the player controlling Kara, and then therefore Kara's spirit controls Frisk, or is the player controlling Frisk, which is more likely, which then influences Kara's spirit and the genocide ending? Is the player even specifically Frisk's soul in Undertale in the first place? That seems to be the implication ever since Deltarune came out, but there's no confirmation telling if we, as the player, are just a weird third entity or literally Frisk's soul. If we are Frisk's soul, then how much control do they have? Are they just chill with all of our actions and are in sync with us, or are they even aware of us as the supposed soul? See, like I said, strange relationship. Anyways, even though the subversion that the child you name in the beginning of the game isn't actually Frisk like you'd expect, but instead Kara is insanely good, the fact you only get to know that Frisk is actually their own person at the end of a specific ending makes it so that we don't get to know much about Frisk other than maybe that they don't like soda? We can't even be sure all of the narrated dialogue is Frisk too, so it's kind of a shame in my opinion how little we get of Frisk. And again, due to this execution, we don't have any real confirmation about the relationship between the player, Kara's spirit, and Frisk, meaning we could barely theorize about how Frisk could be feeling about a situation we can't confirm, which on some level may be purposeful. I mean, who knows what Toby Fox is thinking, because I certainly don't. But regardless, while it is definitely fun to question and analyze these three forces at play, it ends up convoluted to figure out at best, and easy to misinterpret or miss completely at worst. Much of the triangle relationship I've mentioned many times now is told to you rather than shown to you in Undertale in my opinion. Or honestly, told isn't even the right word in this context. It's kind of just like waved in your direction with certain dialogue in all different spots with expectance to analyze super heavily and see everything to hopefully understand what's going on and interpret something for yourself. Which, my god, the Undertale fandom is capable of, that's for sure. Now, to clarify, I'm not saying that this is inherently a bad thing. I did love and still do love Undertale. And it is, in its own right, an engaging way to go about presenting a story as it leaves room for different interpretations and so much discussion that has contributed to a flourishing fandom. It also makes a commentary about how a player will do anything, even bad things, just to see everything they can in a video game. It's just that, even though it's still wonderful, my only real criticism with Undertale's story is that it can be confusing for some, as if you fail to also interpret and understand that you, the player, are an important entity in the world of Undertale yourself, then you just kind of miss a lot of what the game is trying to do. That being having you hold accountability and have consequences for your actions that have an impact on the world of Undertale. By making it so interpretation-based with no clear answer as to your role in the story, it's easy for people to remove themselves from a game that is purposely trying to make you a part of it. Now, as for Deltarune, on the other hand, things are done quite differently in this area, and my entire critique I had with Undertale is completely gone. The relationship between the player and the so-called self-insert character is no longer in this vague limbo lost to only beating the game through specific circumstances, as well as a third entity making it more confusing. Instead, it is in the spotlight, shown and told to us through cutscenes, dialogue, and additional context. Not only that, but the concept of the so-called self-insert being their own person being shown through subverting expectations is not lost in Deltarune, as the end scene in Chapter 1 still strongly establishes that you are not Kris, in a similar way that Undertale tells you that you are not Frisk. Only this time, instead of telling us this idea in only one of the endings in a shorter game with many endings through words, it's presented to us in an ending to only the first chapter in a much longer game visually. Like, when it comes to Undertale, if people still see everything and are confused, I would understand it as the game is very vague about certain things, but if somebody doesn't understand that the player is an important controlling entity in Deltarune after completing it, then that's your own issue at that point. Now, remember when I talked about unique executions of similar concepts between Undertale and Deltarune? Well, when it comes to Deltarune, the relationship between the soul and the supposed self-insert comes along with the sentiment from Kris that we only really understand more as we progress through the game. Not only are you, the player and soul, not Kris, but Kris themselves as a person rejects your very presence. Kris conceptually is an improvement on what was done in Undertale with Frisk and Kara, except instead of it being about how the player is able to connect through to that world and actually impact it with your choices via characters who are actually their own person, it's more about answering the question of what would happen if the silent protagonist who is actually their own person was not only aware of us, but hated and despised us, the player, because we stripped away their agency by playing the game. Yup, consider me compelled!
I can do anything! Chaos, chaos! Bye-bye!
Alright, so currently the extent of the soul's power is a bit up in the air. What determines what choices the soul is given? And is Kris at least somewhat involved in what choices we have? Are the choices Kris's choices versus the player's choice? Is Kris the one who allows the player to speak somehow? What's with the red screen and the weird route where no options are provided? Does Kris know the extent of the soul's power? Well, what we do know for certain is that Kris has the power to remove their soul from their body, aka the player, which leads to fantastic out-of-body sequences. When Kris removes the soul from their body, they seem to be limping or at bare minimum, have less energy. We can imply it hurts or at least takes work to rip out the soul. Kris seems to need the soul to some extent, to what exact extent we are unaware. The soul, when possessing actions over Kris, cannot play the piano, or at least cannot play it well. Pianos are used as a narrative motif for Kris to solidify on a personal level that not only did they have their own life before the soul became the player somehow, but Kris can also play the piano very well and used to do so often. Kris is able to take control over their own actions to play the piano when we, the player, cannot proceed without them. Kris is able to take occasional different independent physical actions despite the soul being inside them. said actions usually tending to be reflexes or reactions. It's kind of like how we control where they go, but they already know how to put one leg in front of the other and will do so on their own. We don't have to tell them that much. They've lived a life up until this point. So in my opinion, their independent physical acts can be described similarly to how the soul can't control everything and neither can Kris. It's hard to describe because despite taking Kris's autonomy very often by playing, I don't think the intention here is for us to feel bad about playing the game. We'll know more as chapters release, but for now, the way I can describe it is that the soul and Kris have a weird codependent relationship where Kris is losing more than us, but nobody involved is necessarily evil and getting their way or even happy. Except, you know, if you decide to go through the route where you can be evil by manipulating and abusing Kris's childhood friend, then you'd forcefully be getting your way evilly, but that's completely beside the point. The relationship between the soul and Kris is this odd codependent situation and system, although a worse one for Kris, again. They get their autonomy stolen from them often because of us. Like, for example, Kris has the ability to say whatever words we put into their mouth in their own tone, including sometimes taking actions to prohibit those words being heard, but at the end of the day, we put those words in their mouth. The specifics about how the soul works and why we get the choices we do is unknown, but at the end of the day, we're still calling the shots on what is selected. Kris's control over our selections includes things like the player being provided the option somehow, some way, to turn the doorknob, and Kris then somehow, some way, hears that exactly or is forced by those exact words as a literal action to turn the doorknob. But then Kris independently decides to not open the door to prevent us, the player, from entering. Guys, I'm sorry, I have to say it, but it's just so awesome. The silent protagonist being against you is so interesting and so much more fleshed out in execution to me personally than what Undertale did, despite Undertale still being fantastic. A successor at its finest. Like, we know the soul can seemingly read people's thoughts, indicated with brackets, and the player is not Kris, so, presumably, only the soul, aka us, can do this despite them being our host? The soul is something that Kris hides about themselves from others when they can, too. Many characters who have known Kris their whole life comment how their voice has changed, implying that the soul, or rather the player's presence, hasn't always been possessing Kris, and, just like stated before, that they have a life of their own they were living before you showed up, and we get to know these people. This is also another reinforcement of the idea that we, the soul, are putting words into Kris's mouth that they can say how they wish to, which gives us glimpses to who they are a lot of the time when people comment on it, but is still stripping them of their freedom of speech. Most of all, though, we know Kris is working against us. We don't know their intentions because we are not them, we don't know them, we know of them, and Kris tries their damn hardest to make sure we know as little as possible. Kris, under some circumstances, is working with what has been revealed to be the main threat in the story, the Roaring Knight. Only 4 chapters of Deltarune are out currently, so we, 1, have no confirmation of who the Roaring Knight is, and 2, have no real idea of why Kris is working with them other than a supposed promise they made. In fact, the mystery surrounding Kris specifically is mostly created by none other than Kris themselves in many aspects by hiding things from us specifically, which, sorry, that's just the coolest thing ever. I love Kris so much, they're such an icon. Anyways, as stated previously, they reject our very presence. They don't want us making so much progress and intervene to stop us from reading the code to the shelter because they don't want us messing with their plans. The very code that they know themselves already, by the way. Which, there are dozens of ways it's stated we are not Kris, but one of my favorites is actually this one, because inherently if we were Kris, we would already know this code, but we don't. We aren't them. They don't like us hijacking their soul, because obviously who would? And when we choose to hurt their childhood friend, they utterly despise us and try to do all they can to undo our actions, only for us to mess it up again. Inherently, by playing the game, you learn that you, by playing, are inhabiting a person who is aware of your presence and dislikes it, and under certain circumstances, utterly despises it. Kris's identity, freedom, and autonomy is something that they so often are stripped away of thanks to us, and as a result, we only get the privilege of getting to know of Kris. So, who is Kris? Well, as stated previously, that is shrouded in mystery from Kris themselves and from the disconnect between us, the puppeteer, and Kris, the puppet. In the prophecy, we see Kris be described as the cage with a soul and human parts, which is purposely a vague statement just like the rest of the parts of the prophecy we see, but I'm almost certain that this is meant to be interpreted as Kris being the cage and human parts while we are the soul. The way it's worded actively dehumanizes Kris, in a way that even Susie notices and comments on in her own way. With the wording of Kris being a cage, the bird cage Kris owns is really interesting to me. The bird cage that they specifically own for us, the player. Kris, the cage, for small moments at a time transfers us to another cage to be free of us. The very bird cage that they own to stick us in on a consistent basis, presumably almost every night before they sleep, as Chapter 1 isn't a one-time occurrence. Kris is the unwanted and unwilling vessel, as they are not a blank slate for us to choose who they are. Which I genuinely do think that in future chapters, the vessel we make in the beginning of the game will appear again in some shape or some form, and be mentioned for the sake of compelling the player, whether it be mentioning the choices we made for that vessel or something else entirely. Maybe in the future it will be brought up for a scene like, this is what you wanted Kris to be, but they're not. They're Kris, you know? Like the one and only Kris, the one who is a teenager in high school and lives in a small town called Hometown. Kris was adopted into the Dreemurr household full of goat monsters at a young age, and is the only human in Hometown. Kris is very close with their brother Asriel and seems to look up to him, especially missing him ever since he went off to college. To an extent, Kris may even live in Asriel's shadow, as seen by so many people in Hometown know Kris for just being Asriel's brother alongside Kris's side of the room compared to Asriel's. I think it can be fair to assume that Kris's only friend for a very long time was Asriel as well, with the slight exception of their childhood friend and neighbor Noelle Holiday, and by extension Noelle's sister Des Holiday, who Asriel and Kris spent time with, although Des didn't seem to tolerate Kris's mischief very much. Sometime during Asriel's absence, Kris's parents, Toriel and Asgore, have gotten a divorce. Ever since the divorce, Asgore lives in his own flower shop doing extra cleaning jobs for the holidays for money, and Toriel is living with Kris still being the primary caretaker. We know that Kris, when they were younger, had rude humor as they would pull many pranks and were generally a chaotic kid, and we know that they still hold a lot of that chaos and drama in their personality to this day, as it's especially shown with their gravitation and friendship towards Susie alongside other moments in the game. For lack of words, Kris is a weird kid. They're a teenage loser in the most affectionate way that makes you go, yep, that's a teenager indeed. Kris is somebody who probably finds anime and being a nerd to be cringy despite playing video games with their brother and playing games with Birdly. They're someone who still owns a How to Draw Dragons book, and as a child made 7 playing cards to cheat that eventually got lost in the cushions of the couch. We're also told by Toriel that when Kris was younger, they owned a headband of horns that they wore constantly as they were surrounded by monsters who also had horns, causing them to think that they would grow in horns someday too. And honestly, who could blame them? When it comes to monsters and humans, the only difference ever talked about is biology. Mentally and socially, monsters are not at all different from humans that we know of. Yet, despite this, We see Kris be treated like an outsider compared to the rest of Hometown. Even those who knew them when they were younger, for example Rudy, still knew their chaotic personality, their at the time mean humor, as well as how they're less talkative than most and, even if perhaps affectionately, perceives them as the creepy kid next door. Them being a human makes it so that they do not fit into the society they find themselves in, and in other words, the world they live in. As a result of Kris's small difference, there's this awkwardness or hostility as a result, and most monsters don't really know what to think or do about Kris, despite nothing needing to be done about them in the first place, because they're not actually any different from monsters. Even people who still mean well still don't really know what to do with Kris. An example of this being the Taking Care of Humans book that was checked out by Toriel multiple times. As for how Kris thinks about themselves, it's been made clear to us that they feel like a stranger in their own body as a result of the perhaps literal stranger in their body controlling them most of the time and stripping away their autonomy. Shoving our decisions and choices onto them that they don't always align with results in us putting them into a box. So, Kris is an outsider in their society despite not really being different from others. Kris is someone who feels like a stranger in their own body. Kris is somebody who is often shoved into a box thanks to us. And finally, Kris is somebody who goes by they, them pronouns. I personally think Kris is a great example of genderqueer representation, as their struggles in Hometown aren't exactly linked to their gender, but are very similar to those who are genderqueer. The struggles of genderqueer people are shown through allegories, and within the world of Deltarune, Kris's pronouns are respected and used by everyone as the world of Deltarune is inherently accepting of queerness. Noelle crushes on Susie. Susie, when seeing the prophecy, doesn't say a girl likes me, but rather, wait, someone likes me, even though it's played off as a joke because, you know, it's Birdly. Birdly is still willing to have Kris join his stupid ass harem, and Rule's card is doing whatever he's doing with his polycule that doesn't work out, not because it's a polycule, but because Rule's card, the lovable idiot, is in it. Even Kris being a quiet person is something that's never really painted as a bad thing. Deltarune just doesn't do that sort of thing. Like, sure, Susie says quiet people piss me off, but not only does Susie grow to protect Kris from King saying those exact words, but later Susie is able to reword something similar to the feeling she probably had in the beginning, which is, I hate when people don't tell you their whole deal. Generally, though, we get very clear information that even when Kris has control over their own voice and body, they still seem to not use words very often and find other methods of expressing themselves, such as pranks or jokes for attention and playing the piano. This isn't to say Kris doesn't talk at all. They do when need be, or when they want to, but it's made obvious that they're a quiet person and it's not a bad thing, it's just a part of who they are. Noelle notices Kris is talking so much and asks if they're okay because she takes Kris as talking so much as something wrong. And in the weird route, she notes that Kris's voice is quiet and mumbly when they are away from the soul, and that she missed it so much she started crying, which is all incredibly noteworthy coming from Noelle, as she is their childhood friend and notices the soul's presence differing from the Kris she knows extremely well. Kris, under our control, isn't weird, isn't hard to understand for others, has a good social life, and has friends. And some may say, well, it's good we gave them a voice, they weren't using it anyway, but I disagree with that notion, because even though on a base level these aren't bad traits to have at the end of the day, they aren't Kris's, and Kris still deserves to have their life, their freedom, and their voice, no matter how infrequently they use it, or how weird, introverted, that's based off of what Susie said like one time, I'm pretty sure that's actually, and quiet they are, sorry. I believe that at least someday, even if the soul wasn't there, Susie and Kris would one day become friends based off when Susie says, man, we could have been friends way before, and how they just get along so well even without our input. Actions speak louder than words, and in the terms of Kris, who not only doesn't use their voice as their primary form of expression, as well as being a narratively meaningful and meta way of using the silent protagonist trope, this is taken to the extreme. One of the first independent acts that impacts the relationship they have on their own is them choosing to protect Susie in chapter 1. There's so many instances of them using physical movement and actions to express their emotions, and so much to back up them not being textbook evil. They do care about others. They protect Susie during the sword route, they try to prevent the player from being mean to Rousey, and they especially try to undo our actions towards Noelle in a weird route, as well as take Birdley to the hospital. They listen to Spamton's request to go see him alone multiple times out of their own free will, and try to help Spamton, presumably, as his situation feels similar to theirs with the soul. Spamton, despite his distorted speech, is seeking freedom, and that's made pretty clear. So seeing Spamton as a literal puppet on strings, having them cut off, and then watching as even when they're cut, he is still not able to be free, and worse, basically dies, has Kris shaken up and screaming, or giving a shaky "I'm fine" depending on the words we give them to speak. Sort of reminds me of how in the sword route, the line, "You were used up," has Kris pale and looking away from the screen. They clearly, so badly, want their freedom without having to sacrifice their livelihood. Even though Kris tries their best to hide information from us, we still know so much of Kris. One of the reasons I believe Kris gravitates towards Susie so much, aside from them both sharing the same chaotic energy, is that Susie makes her own decisions despite the player. She is seen denying her choices and only listening to them when she chooses to, rather than because she has to, and I think that maybe that gives Kris a sense of security. Even though Susie bullied Kris before as she leaned into the bully persona people put onto her, when she's in the dark world, she doesn't turn into a new person. She just comes out of her shell more and is able to express who she actually is. Susie's weird, rude, sarcastic, selfish, and chaotic, yet despite all of that, she's Susie. And isn't it wonderful that she's her? It's hard to put into words, but for some reason, seeing Susie next to you, you felt like whatever you were, just for right now, it might be okay. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking or subscribing, as it's the best way for me to know you watched it. Let me know in the comments if you would like me to try to also analyze characters like Susie or Rousey too, because there's definitely so much more to talk about with Deltarune, and even with Kris themselves, as we don't know everything since only 4 chapters are out currently. Personally, I think at some point the other characters within the game, like Susie, will have to learn about the player in some way. I mean, right? It's such a narratively important aspect of the game. I don't see an outcome where in the next 3 chapters, or in an unlikely chance more, that we don't have the others learn more about the soul. I mean, heck, Rousey probably even knows already, even if perhaps vaguely. The tone and pace has already shifted greatly out of the cycle it set up in chapter 4, a wonderful writing decision in my opinion, and we see Susie already question the soul at least a little before being interrupted by her concern for Rousey, so I'm sure even more focus on the soul will happen in future chapters. Kris is such a wonderful person, and I hope that in later chapters that there's at least a peaceful outcome that allows them their freedom while still allowing us to be relevant to the world of Deltarune, because I want Kris to flourish, to be happy, and to have the freedom they deserve.